Howdy, y'all. Welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we're going to be looking at Charleston, South Carolina. I actually had the luxury recently of making my way down to Charleston, South Carolina to explore some of the sites that I wanted to see down there. And I actually have a good friend from high school who, after graduation, decided to go to college in Charleston. And he's been down there ever since, and I have not seen him yet. So this trip down there was not only a great time to reconnect with one of my best friends, but it was also the furthest that I have traveled yet from my home in Pennsylvania. So this was a great journey for me, one that really opened my eyes to a lot of new things that are going on in the world. And what I saw in Charleston was nothing less than remarkable. It's an absolutely beautiful, spectacular place. The weather, while I was there, was actually rather cold. My friend told me it was probably the coldest winter he has had in Charleston so far. And yet, even through all of that, I was still able to see some of the most beautiful creations, some of the most beautiful architecture, some of the most haunting architecture that I have ever come across. One of the most interesting things that you'll come to see in this video, and something that I wanted to point out right from the get-go before we get into this history, is that Charleston was always a store fort city. We see many fortifications in Charleston, but something that we do not see often identified, and something that the mainstream really shies away from, but something that has been factually proven within the last few years, is that Charleston was in fact an entirely fortified city. The city itself was a store fort. Everything that we see within most of the ancient or historic part of Charleston was in fact once within these store fort walls. So the question then becomes, where are these walls now? And the answer is actually something that you might be familiar with when we entertain different theories about history, theories when we're looking at if different cataclysms happened, if different things affected the landscape, if different weather patterns occurred that made the landscape actually rise. This is something that often comes into play when we see these different cities that actually have multiple different layers to when they were built. As if instead of demolishing the first rendition of the city or the first build of the city was actually just lifted. The ground level was raised up multiple feet to just cover over this first story of buildings. And then it was built on top of. And then it happened again and again. And you wonder what sort of events occurred in the history of these landscapes that called for that sort of thing happening. Now, recently, I believe in about 2015, there were excavations that began on different parts of the city around Charleston. And what they came to find is that the ancient fortified walls of Charleston are actually feet below the city. When you dig down roughly 6 to 10 feet below the city, you will begin to see the city walls of Charleston, which are mostly built out of ancient red brick. Also, I just wanted to give you a bit more information on my personal life. As many of you know who are familiar with the channel, I've been going through quite a bit of hardship throughout the last 2 months, and I thank you all so much for all your well wishes and your prayers. And I just wanted to let you know that if you are unfamiliar with the situation, someone that was very important to my life, someone that I loved and I cared about very much, is no longer in my life anymore. They will no longer be part of the channel. And even though I do all of this research on my own, I did have a partner who I would bounce these ideas off of and who would help me to make these videos even better for you. But that person is no longer in my life, and that loss has really been tearing into me. So that is part of the reason why I decided to take this trip down to Charleston. I also decided to let you into my personal life a little bit. There are now 124,000 of you that follow me here or subscribe to me here on YouTube. So I did go ahead and decide to make an Instagram. On this, you will see where I go with my personal life on a day-to-day basis, the different adventures I take, and you'll get a better look at the architecture and the exploration that I'm doing around my town and in the cities that I visit. So if that's something that you would be interested in, you can definitely subscribe or follow or whatever they call it on Instagram. You can do that at The Jared Boosters, all one word, The Jared Boosters. And there you will find a little bit more personal information about me. And if you were ever interested, we could connect more and you could contact me on there. So I thank you so much for that. Now, going forward, I also wanted to give a huge thank you to the musical artist known as Goodlander. Goodlander made the song that has become basically the theme song for my channel, known as Jared's Song. When I met Goodlander, I did not really get a lot of information about him. He was a rather anonymous figure, and he didn't really ask for any sort of credit, but I wanted to always give it to him. And if you're out there still watching Goodlander, I appreciate you so much for what you've done for my channel. And if you ever want me to promote any more of your music, just let me know. And on that same sort of wavelength, I also wanted to say that throughout these last 4 to 5 years that I've been uploading these videos about the old world, I've gone from working multiple part-time jobs, just struggling to get by, to now I am actually able to really work when I want to and mostly work on these videos. And that's something I'm very appreciative of. But I want to let you know that if you want to support me or support the channel or even reach out to me and speak more directly, there is a link in my YouTube profile, and I would love to hear from you, and any support you can give makes all of these journeys that I take, all the adventures, all the ways that I pry into the old museums and private collections and photographs that we're not supposed to see, I'm able to find them with all of you supporting the channel. So when you like and share and subscribe, and when you put this work out there, we finally peel back the veil on the old world. So I just wanted to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for being part of that. Thank you for helping me through the hard times, and thank you for getting me to a point in my life where I can be proud of the research that I'm doing. Now let's begin on the oldest part of Charleston in the French Quarter with the old slave market and the Pink House. Now, I think the most interesting aspect about Charleston's history and many other histories of these places in the South is that they began as star forts. And these fortifications, we are told, were created for numerous different reasons. But when we look at Charleston specifically, we are told that this involves piracy. Not only were there different European settlers that were looking to come to the area, looking to control the rivers and the ports within Charleston, but along these same lines, we're told fortifications were also constructed to keep out not only indigenous people, but also pirates and privateers that would often attack Charleston. When we get into that aspect of the history, we're told the infamous Blackbeard was amongst others who attacked this landscape. And furthermore, when we look at the richest part, the merchant area of Charleston that was within the ancient Star Fort walls, this was known as the French Quarter. And within the French Quarter, there was a specific type of stone, a specific type of architecture that was used in the creation of many of these buildings. And that stone, that sort of architecture itself, and even the people in Charleston were said to come from Bermuda. So let us look into this history a little bit more, because when we look at the oldest home in Charleston, for example, it is considered to be the Pink House, also known simply as 17 Chalmers Street, and this was apparently built in 1712. The Pink House is today not open to the public, but as recently as a few years ago, this over 300-year-old building served as one of the most historic art galleries in all of Charleston. Now, we're told the Pink House's color, the pink, actually derives from the use of Bermuda stone, and the Pink House sits in Charleston's famous French Quarter. The entire historic French Quarter, according to the narrative, was within the ancient or original city star fort, the original walls that once encompassed the entire city. Now, this is according to the current narrative. And when we look at the oldest maps of Charleston, we can see that from the beginning of recorded history, Charleston was a fortified star fort city. It appears on maps already fortified. Now, we're told the French Quarter was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1973, one of the earliest to be added to this register. And the French Quarter also contains, besides the Pink House, the French Huguenot Church, which is the only surviving French Calvinist congregation remaining in the entire United States of America. But when we look at Bermuda, besides the whole Bermuda Triangle conspiracy, which itself lends credence to the superstitions that often accompany Charleston, we are also told that the closest mainland to Bermuda is the Carolinas, roughly 640 miles away. Consider that epic distance traveled as we dive deeper into the history of the architecture of Charleston, because the stone that was used to create much of the early city and further parts of Charleston outside the city walls was all said to have been shipped in from Bermuda, over 640 miles away. We're told the stone that was quarried in Bermuda in the 17th and 18th centuries often was a mixture of limestone that was broken down through interglacial dunes mixed with sand. It was battered over time by the oceans and then refused over time into sandstone. We're also told that this sandstone makeup originally appeared to be a whitish hue. It was white stone when it was sent from Bermuda to Carolina, but over time, without constant whitewashing, these original stones from the 18th century have turned to a beautiful pinkish hue. Bermuda, according to this narrative, was first settled in 1609 through roughly the year 1612 by the Spanish navigator known as Juan de Bermudez. By 1612, though, the English had also made their way to Bermuda, claiming it as an extension of the Virginia Company. We can see how most of the earliest major settlements in the New World came under the iron thumb of these European merchants. Something that really intrigued me the most is all the different varieties of architecture that we see throughout the city of Charleston. Depending on what part of the city you are in, you can almost tell what time period that this architecture is being attributed to, and yet the history itself is still so questionable, because as we dig below the surface, more and more of the architecture looks the same, as if this was all built on one unified plan, and these plans have been changed over time. But something else that I wanted to point out is that most of the original inhabitants of this city were said to have arrived there from Bermuda, and not only did they arrive over 640 miles, but they also brought with them a certain type of stone, a certain type of block, these massive blocks, enough of them to create all of these massive pieces of architecture throughout the city. So I found that to be absolutely remarkable. And another thing that I wanted to show you is one of the days I was in Charleston, they were having quite stormy weather, and I've never really seen the ocean like this before anywhere in the Northeast. We were looking at winds anywhere from 45 to 50 miles per hour, and they created some of the most gnarly waves I have ever seen. They were at least 10 to 15 feet tall. From Bermuda, over 10,000 settlers emigrated to South Carolina, with their focus being on Charleston. Amongst these merchants who moved to this fortified landscape were the Tucker family, that included Henry Tucker, George Tucker, and Thomas Tudor Tucker. However, the origins of the Pink House and many of these structures that were related to this Bermuda stone hide a much more swashbuckling portion of Charleston's history. The Pink House was said to have begun operation as a tavern in the 1710s, owned by the enigmatic figure known as Madame Mincy, a French Huguenot. Within the Pink House, there was claimed all sorts of debauchery took place, as Mincy was said to have led a brothel by some accounts, while others claimed that the Pink House was the leading French distillery in all of Charleston. Still, Local tradition claims that the Pink House was a frequent haunt of the pirates, privateers, and others on the run from their past. We're told the Pink House, until the 1780s, served as a location with an ill reputation, and legend holds that Edward Thatch, also known better by his moniker Blackbeard, used the Pink House as his base of operations while he was within the city of Charleston. In 1718, Blackbeard was said to have often pirated ships making passage between Bermuda and Charleston, culminating in Blackbeard blockading all of Charleston, and Blackbeard and his crew stopped and boarded every single ship that was said to have attempted passage in or out of the Charleston harbor. Blackbeard was said to have during this time captured at least 9 vessels, including an English ship known as the Crowley, which included a key member of the council for the province of Carolina, Samuel Wragg. Interestingly, by roughly June 9th into the morning of June 10th, more English ships descended to the Carolinas with their mission to eliminate these pirates. According to the legend, an epic battle ensued, and the Virginia colony itself took Blackbeard's head back to the Chesapeake Bay. That in itself is interesting, as the Chesapeake Bay was one of the former capitals of the Susquehannock indigenous people, and at the time, this was also the headquarters for much of the Virginia Company's operations, seeing that this Virginia Company first took over the Susquehannock lands. We can dive into the Susquehannock or Conestoga wagon, the Susquehannock or Conestoga repeating rifle, also known as a Lancaster rifle, sometimes now referred to as a Kentucky. But one of the most important things that we come to find is that the Susquehannock actually introduced the European settlers to the cultivation and use of tobacco. And we can see this in many forms, including how a cigar is often called a stogie. Stogie being short for Conestoga. So we can see how this Virginia Company, one of the original companies, these merchant companies that appeared to come to America, come to these different landscapes, and they took over what was already there, the trade routes, the routes of travel, the architecture, and the inventions that had been created by the indigenous people. And they took these things, and then once they controlled these areas, once the Europeans had actually settled into these landscapes and taken them over, they then had the ability to create the plausible deniability within the history. So when we read the narrative, we can never pinpoint with accuracy exactly what was going on. We only have an idea of what was happening. And it appears to be that same way in many different cities around the country. You can find that American history at best is questionable. And one of the most questionable aspects of that is the early architecture, which appears to be these massive fortified cities that have these different stones, different blocks, different pieces of architecture that would be almost impossible to imagine being built in a fledgling country like the United States, unless there were other means for it to have happened, whether they existed in some capacity earlier, or if the trade routes with the indigenous people, if their overall structure of these indigenous cities were much larger than they are given credit for, as if the European settlers had something to discover, something to conquer, and then something to rewrite in the narrative. When we look at the oldest maps, when we look at the oldest photographs, that appears to be what the history is to me. But again, that is just a theory, because we have to read the current narrative with a grain of salt. But when we look at Charleston and we look at how this was from the earliest mentions of this city, something of a fortified star fort, and then as we dive into the actual fortifications, the different bastions, the different locations within this city that held significant importance, and we look at that architecture specifically, the narratives become even more convoluted. We can see that stones were being shipped from over 640 miles away to construct an entire French quarter of this city that itself was within the ancient fortified star fort walls. And at the same time, there is very little credit given to any sort of indigenous people that settled Charleston before these European settlers arrived there. It's as if we are told that some sort of conglomeration of pirates and other settlers from Bermuda came to Charleston, and within this short time frame, they were able to erect almost everything that we see within the city, because Charleston, as you may know, is a very old city. A lot of the architecture has been here for hundreds of years. What we are seeing in the photographs that I took when I traveled there is the same architecture that was said to have existed here decades and decades ago, remaining unchanged since as far back as the 1800s. So again, take everything you see today with a grain of salt, but understand that Charleston, like so many other cities in our country, is full of more mysteries than we have answers. Now, here is where we get to the part of the video where we're looking at the photographs of Charleston directly around the time period of the Civil War. These will be photographs after Charleston was attacked and directly before it was attacked. And these are some of the most unique photographs that you will see of Charleston because, again, we have a major United States city, a city that was a hub of merchants and a hub of trade that was absolutely reduced to rubble on a level that you would not expect given the technology that we're told was available during the time period of the Civil War. We're looking at buildings that appear absolutely destroyed. Now, my favorite place that I got to visit, and this might be a little bit obscure, but my favorite place that I got to see in person in Charleston was the Magnolia Cemetery. This was absolutely beautiful. I honestly have never seen a cemetery like this in my entire life. I mean, the way that it was laid out, it was as if you were walking through a museum, like an outdoor museum where everything was constructed in such a perfect way. There was such a layout to everything where I was walking through for at least 45 minutes, and then all of a sudden I came upon a lake that was just in the middle of this cemetery, and it was one of the most beautiful lakes I have ever seen. There were cranes and there were pelicans, there were ducks, there were signs that said watch out for alligators. It was absolutely beautiful. There was a nice wooden bridge going across this lake, and on either side of this lake were absolutely ancient burials, some of the most beautiful headstones and statues and mausoleums that I have ever seen in my entire life. Walking through this area, I felt like I was walking through the most historic part of Charleston that I had seen on my entire journey. So that's why I thought I would share these photographs with you. They also made for some of the most beautiful photographs that I took on my entire trip. Now, according to this narrative, and there is a pyramid within this Magnolia Cemetery as well, and we will look at that. So, according to this current narrative, the Magnolia Cemetery is one of the most historic rural cemeteries in all of South Carolina. We're told the first board of the Magnolia Cemetery was assembled in 1849, with the cemetery itself being constructed and dedicated in 1850, with Edward C. Jones serving as the architect. In 1978, the cemetery was added to the National Register of Historic Places, and it's an absolutely beautiful cemetery. As I mentioned earlier, the location of this cemetery had apparently been one of the largest plantations in all of South Carolina, and it was known as Magnolia Umbra. The house of this plantation was described as being newly built in roughly 1820, and it was said to be rather large. The cemetery was constructed on the remains of this plantation in 1850, and these plans were laid out by Edward Jones to include a Gothic chapel that was also designed by Jones and was said to be rather prominent architecture. The chapel was located right next to the central lake, and this chapel was still under construction in early 1851, but was completed later that year. Both the chapel and the porter's lodge, or the lodge house, were said to have sustained heavy damage during the cemetery's occupation and destruction by federal forces during the Civil War. Essentially, we're told that the Yankees came in and destroyed this cemetery. The porter's lodge at the entrance was then demolished in 1868, but the chapel was slightly rebuilt and used until at least 1876. Now, the Magnolia Cemetery is rather interesting. We're told it has a little bit of a tarnished past, and that is to say the least. First, because it was built on one of the largest and most important, the most robust pieces of land in Charleston that contained this Magnolia plantation. But beyond that, we also have this idea that people of color were not allowed within the Magnolia Cemetery. And we actually have an article that was published in the Charleston newspaper, or a newspaper of Charleston, in 1909. And I quote, "There is a rule in Charleston that people of color shall not be allowed to parade through the Magnolia Cemetery, the principal burying place of the whites." End quote. And this exclusion policy was actually enforced regardless of social status, such as in the case of Dr. Crum, a prominent doctor out of Charleston who was prohibited from even driving through the cemetery in the early 1900s. Now, notable people that were buried in the Magnolia Cemetery, and we will go through many of their burial sites in the photographs that we're going to be looking at now, but these include William Aiken Jr., who passed in 1887. He was the governor of South Carolina. We have John Bennett, who passed in 1956, who was a famous author and illustrator. We have Thomas Bennett Jr., who was the governor of South Carolina, and he passed in 1865. We also have William H. Brawley, who was a representative of South Carolina and a federal judge, who passed in 1916. Sally F. Chapin, who organized the Charleston's Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1881, and she passed in 1896. We have Langdon Chavez, an American politician and the president of the Second Bank of the United States, who passed in 1857. James Conner, who was a general in the Confederate Army. We have George E. Dixon, who passed in 1864. He was a commander of a Confederate submarine known as H.L. Hunley. We have Frank Bunker Gilbreth, who passed in 2001, a famous author. William J. Grayson, the representative of South Carolina, who passed in 1863. Wilson Godfrey Harvey, who was the governor of South Carolina, who passed in 1932. J.C. Hemphill, who was a journalist and editor, who passed away in 1927. John Edwards Holbrook, who was a physician, famous in Charleston, who passed away in 1871. Daniel Elliott Huger, who was the senator from South Carolina, who passed in 1854. Horace Lawson Hunley, a Confederate Marine engineer and a developer of submarines, who passed in 1863. Micah Jenkins, who was a Confederate general, who passed in 1864. Mitchell Campbell King, a physician, who passed away in 1901. George Swinton Lagarde, a U.S. representative, who passed in 1913. Hugh Lagarde, an attorney general, who passed in 1843. William Logan, a representative in 1941. Andrew Gordon McGrath, South Carolina's governor, who passed in 1893. Burnett Rhett Mayback, the senator from South Carolina and South Carolina's governor, who passed in 1954. John Darlington Newcomer, a famous American architect, who passed in 1931. Ziba B. Oaks, a slave trader, who passed in 1871. Josephine Pinckney, a novelist and poet, who passed in 1957. St. Julian Ravenel, a physician and chemist, who passed in 1882. Robert Rhett, the U.S. representative and senator from South Carolina, who passed in 1913. Roswell S. Ripley, a Confederate general, who passed in 1887. William Gilmore Simms, a poet, novelist, and historian, who passed away in 1870. Charles Henry Symington, a Confederate colonel and federal judge, who passed away in 1904. Julius Waddies Waring, United States federal judge who was linked to the American Civil Rights Movement, who passed away in 1968. We also have Richard Smith Wally, a U.S. representative from South Carolina, who passed away in 1951. And we also have numerous British war graves of 5 Royal Navy and Merchant Navy personnel who were killed during World War II. And we have multiple dedications to the Confederate soldiers from the Civil War in America. According to the currently accepted timeline, which we are going to go through today, the history of Charleston begins in 1680. So again, we have this sort of forgetting of the actual narrative, because there must have been indigenous people who occupied Charleston. And if you read other sources, you will actually find that there were numerous indigenous groups that left behind residue that they once occupied Charleston. But the currently accepted timeline begins in 1680, when we're told there was a settlement of English immigrants, mostly from Barbados, who arrived to the future town of Charleston. Then, just 1 year later, in 1681, we're told St. Philip's Church was founded in Charleston. In 1699, we're told that a hurricane hit and destroyed Charleston. So if there was any indigenous history or architecture that was there, this would be the time period when that would have been rewritten. We're also told an epidemic hit Charleston in 1699 and wiped out a large portion of the population. In 1708, we're told African slaves comprised the majority of the population within the colony, and they make up a majority of the population and the state until the early 1900s. Charleston town is renamed as one word Charleston in approximately 1719. In 1729, St. Andrew's Society is founded in Charleston, and in 1732, the South Carolina Gazette begins publication in Charleston. In 1734, South Carolina's Jockey Club is founded in Charleston, and in 1736, the Dock Street Theater begins operation. In 1737, South Carolina Society is founded within Charleston, and in 1739, the Stono Rebellion of Slaves occurs near or in Charleston. In 1740, a major fire comes and wipes out even more of the Old World style architecture, and in 1743, the Great Armory of Charleston is built. In 1745, the town gate, or the Gate of the Star Fort, is rebuilt, and in 1748, the Charleston Library Society is organized, the first library society in South Carolina. In 1750, the congregation Kal Kadosh Beth Elohim is founded in Charleston, a large Jewish congregation. In 1752, there's another massive hurricane that wipes out a lot of the architecture. In 1761, St. Michael's Church of Charleston is built, and in 1765, there is direct resistance to the British Stamp Act that occurs in Charleston. In 1766, the St. Cecilia Society is formed in Charleston, and also in 1766, the German Friendly Society is founded in Charleston. In 1769, Charleston becomes part of the Charleston Larger District, and in 1770, the College of Charleston is founded, with a population in the city of 11,000 people. In 1771, the Royal Exchange is built, and in 1773, the Museum Society of Charleston Library is founded. In 1774, the Charleston Tea Party occurs, and in 1780, there is a siege of Charleston. In 1782, the British occupation of Charleston ends, and in 1783, the official charter of Charleston is received. At this time, Richard Hudson becomes the mayor, and the city guard of Charleston is organized. So they essentially had their own guards that monitored the fortified Star Fort city. Interesting. By 1784, the Scottish Presbyterian Church is founded in Charleston, and by 1786, the state capital of South Carolina moves from Charleston to Columbia. At this time in 1786, the South Carolina Golf Club is founded in Charleston, and in 1788, Charleston becomes part of the new U.S. state of South Carolina. By 1789, the Medical Society of South Carolina is founded in Charleston, and in 1790, the population has exceeded 16,000 people. In 1791, the Roman Catholic Church of Charleston is founded, and in 1792, the Charleston Orphan Asylum opens. What a weird timeline. In 1793, the Charleston Theater is founded, and in 1794, the Charleston Mechanical Society is founded. In 1797, the South Carolina Magazine begins publication out of Charleston, and in 1798, the Bank of South Carolina is established within Charleston. In 1799, there is a yellow fever outbreak in South Carolina, specifically in Charleston, that wipes out a large number of the population. And in the year 1800, this population is just over 18,000 people. But also, by the year 1800, we're told Charleston, South Carolina, has the largest Jewish population of any city in the entire United States of America.
Howdy, y'all. Probably what I've been told is the coldest winter in Charleston in a long time. Walking around, exploring. It's about 40 degrees out, and it is beautiful.
In 1803, the Courier newspaper begins publication out of Charleston. In 1806, the Franklin Library Society is founded in Charleston. In 1807, the Washington Light Infantry is founded in Charleston. In 1810, the Castle Pinckney is built with a population in the city of Charleston of just over 24,000 people. In 1813, the Literary and Philosophical Society of South Carolina is founded within Charleston. And by 1815, the Religious Tract Society of Charleston is organized. In 1816, the Emmanuel African Methodist Church is founded in Charleston, and by 1819 the Charleston Mercury newspaper begins publication. So you can see by this point in time, Charleston has a bustling community. We're told by 1820 the Roman Catholic Diocese of Charleston is established, and at this time the population is just over 24,000 people. In 1822, Denmark Vesey's alleged rebellion of slaves is thwarted in Charleston, and by 1823, the Charleston Port Society is founded alongside the Medical College of South Carolina, which is founded in Charleston. In 1824, the Charleston Museum officially opens, and in 1830, the population has exceeded 30,000 people. In 1832 and 33, there's a nullification crisis that is centered inside of Charleston, and by 1833, the Charleston-Hamburg Railroad begins operating, the first railroad to reach Charleston. By 1839, the Charleston Hotel is built. By 1840, the population has actually dwindled down to below 30,000 people. By 1841, the Market Hall is built, as well as the Charleston Arsenal. By 1843, the South Carolina Military Academy opens in Charleston. By 1844, a new Huguenot church is built. By 1847, the Israeli Synagogue is built. By 1849, the South Carolina Institute for the Promotion of Art is organized, and the fair that they held every year begins operation. In 1850, the Magnolia Cemetery is officially established, and at this time, the population is just over 42,000 people. In 1852, the museum founded by the College of Charleston is established, and by 1853, the Elliott Society of Natural History is established in Charleston. By 1855, the South Carolina Historical Society is founded in Charleston, and by 1856, Ryan's Mart, or the slave market that we looked at earlier in the video, is established in Charleston. By 1858, the Carolina Art Association is established in Charleston, and by 1859, the Charleston Marine School begins operation. Now, when we get to the 1860s, you basically know what happens. And that's when we arrive to the first photographs of Charleston that we looked at today, from right before the Civil War and the direct hits or the aftermath of the Civil War in Charleston and how the city was apparently destroyed during this time period. Overall, I would say that Charleston was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Not only just because I got to see part of the country that I have never had a chance to experience before, but also because of the subtle differences that you'll notice when you go from living in Pennsylvania to visiting and traveling to Charleston. There is quite a bit of difference, not really in the architecture, although you can see quite a bit of difference in the actual stone that was used to build the different parts of the city, but the format of the cities and the layout of the cities and the layout of the landscape itself is so much different when you arrive to the South. And something that really stood out to me is also the difference in the people. When you go to the South, I was very taken aback that everyone seemed to have a respect and a sort of understanding of the history. And anytime a question would arise, when I saw a piece of architecture or I arrived at a building where something was just brought to my attention and I wanted to ask about it, the people in Charleston were always very welcoming. They were always very attentive, and they were always very respectful of the history. And I found that to be massively appealing. So going to Charleston, seeing this history, seeing the architecture, it was one of the best experiences that I could have had in this time in my life. Going through something that's so difficult, the loss of a loved one, the loss of something that you thought you were going to have for your life, it becomes difficult to try to process through those emotions without having something profound that you can rely on, that can change you and help motivate you every single day. And that is what this channel does for me. So I'm going to keep diving into these videos, trying to travel to as many locations as possible, trying to dive into as many museums and private collections as possible to find the oldest photographs for you and to compare and contrast the current narrative, to dissect the current narrative, to try to lift the veil that is over the current narrative, to show you what the true history might be. Now, on my way home from Charleston, on my ride back to Pennsylvania from the Baltimore airport, I also saw a bit of interesting information that was posted throughout Baltimore. Apparently, they are developing some sort of hyper-fast sort of train system, Hyperloop system that will get you from Philadelphia to Washington in under 40 minutes. So I found that to be fascinating. Again, where is our technology going? Where has our technology gone from? When we had electric trolleys in most of the major cities in the world in the 19th century, and then they were all eliminated for fossil fuels. But now we're again arriving to the point where those fossil fuels are running out. And whether you believe in the certain aspects that people debate about this history or not, the one thing that we can all agree on is that if we can have free transportation, free electric transportation that's relatively cheap to run, relatively able to be produced on the level that we can basically have the free electric trolley system on a next generation level, then that is something that I think we should all be intrigued for. So again, I would love to hear anything that you have to say about any parts of this video in the comment section down below. If you want to support me or support my work, there is a link in my YouTube profile. You can also check me out on the new Instagram at the Jared Boosters, all one word. You can learn a little bit more about me. You can see a little bit more about my personal life there. And in the end, I just wanted to say from the bottom of my heart, I can't wait to see you all on the next video.